Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Something broke in Domingo Halcon the day his son got lost in the Monte. There was no great mystery for the public or himself who was to blame. The boy Polo hadn't wandered off. No one kidnapped him. The boy had been lost in the Monte for 6 days because Domingo left him there. All he had wanted to do was teach his son a lesson. The boy had been a terror for hours, screaming and demanding all sorts of things. He kicked the back of Domingo's seat like he was stomping a colony of ants, and cried like he was on fire. Domingo had told him to stop. His wife, Anna Cristina, threatened to spank him right on the highway. Still, the boy carried on, wailing and kicking. "That's it," Domingo had said as he pulled the car over. "You're getting the belt, young man." He had met eyes with his son through the rearview mirror, and the boy looked terrified. Domingo often thought of that look in his boy's eyes, thinking how monstrous he must have looked to his son. So terrifying was that look, it sent Polo scurrying out of the car. They'd pulled over beside one of the many ranches that lined the highway. The boy ran through the tall grass and reached a barbed wire fence. He climbed over it like a monkey and ran to the brush line, stopping just before going headlong into thorny mesquite and plate cactus. The day had been so hot, Domingo remembered, and the heat made him angrier. He walked through the tall grass undoing his belt. He whipped it around like a machete, swatting the grass around him. "You get over here this instant!" he screamed. He reached the fence, mostly rust and jagged edges, and looked into the boy's eyes. "I've had it! You don't respect me, you don't respect your mother, you cry and whine like you're prince of the world. But I'll show you, believe you me. You come out of there now!"
"No,"
Polo had told him, seeing he didn't want to cross the fence. "Polo, you get off of that land now!" Domingo seethed. "You are trespassing, young man. Do you know that? In Texas, little boys can be shot for trespassing. Now get out of there!" Polo, he remembered, along with the heat and terrified reaction, gave him a smug look, one that told his father that none of his threats or shouts meant a thing. There, Domingo was playing the boy's game, a game he'd played for too long.
"I won't,"
Polo said, his squeal equally pathetic and defiant. "Really?" Domingo told him. "Fine. I'll tell you what, little prince. Why don't you stay here then, huh? You like it so goddamn much, stay. If you get tired of it, the house is 40 miles that way," he said, pointing with the belt still clenched in his hand. "See you at supper." He walked away to the car before turning around and seeing that Polo hadn't moved, waved. "See you, son," he'd yelled. Once in the car, he had told his worried wife that the next turnaround was in a mile, that they'd only pretend to leave him. It would shock the boy, he'd told her. When Domingo had talked to the reporters, he asked them how he could have known that the turnaround had been closed or that it would take 30 minutes to get back, not the 5 he had planned. How could he have known that the boy wouldn't stay still, frozen in fear? He had looked in the Monte for hours, shouting his son's name, telling him that he wasn't mad. He only wanted to know that he was safe. With no sign of his son, he had to get the nearby town involved, which alerted the media. He was ashamed under the glare of the camera lights and the accusation-laced questions. But he endured it, because the more who knew, the more might come and help look for his son. For the days leading up to the boy's rescue, it was an ominous story, people waiting as the days went by to hear of the little boy being found. So, when the boy was found on the 6th day, the whole world seemed to be watching for a fleeting time. And the weight of that attention was on the boy who'd survived, many said, despite his horribly irresponsible parents. For 3 days after being rescued, the boy didn't speak at all. He was examined by doctors and pathologists and psychiatrists, but surprisingly, there wasn't anything wrong with the boy other than having lost a pound or two. People thought it was a miracle that he survived the cold nights and the hot days in such unforgiving terrain. There were snakes and smugglers and wild dogs roaming the Monte, any of which wouldn't give much thought to hurting a child. When Polo did finally speak, the whole world seemed to be listening. He said that he had cried and ran into the Monte, where he got lost. He followed a path thinking it would get him back to the road, but all it did was lead him deeper into the brush. Scared, he wandered around until nightfall, where he slept under a tree. Somehow he had found a ranch house. The door was unlocked, and though there was no food, there was a working faucet to drink from. Polo said he waited there until he heard the search teams. The whole world was sympathetic to his horrible adventure and showed it with a shower of toys and clothes and scholarships. They gave these things thinking that those trinkets and checks would somehow compensate the boy for having terrible parents. The same went for the reporters, praising Polo's bravery while wordlessly calling Domingo and Ana Cristina monsters. But Domingo said nothing. He understood. He understood when news anchors and talk show hosts howled with rage that he and his wife weren't charged with any crime. They cried neglect and abuse, and some attempted murder. They wanted Polo taken away like Domingo was at home waiting with a bullwhip ready to beat the boy to death. For a week, he was the national example for what was wrong with modern parenting and the modern legal system. Petitions were passed around. Features on websites devoted to people like Gacy and the Pigman. The world thought he was scum, and every time he looked at his son, saw the way he acted after his week in the Monte alone, Domingo understood why. Polo wasn't the same hyper child. Before the Monte, he was perpetually bored and aggressively sought out solitude. His parents annoyed him, and he avoided them at all costs. But after his return, Polo was never out of their sight. Wherever his mother went, he either positioned himself to be able to see her or outright followed her into the rooms. Even when in the bathroom, Domingo and Ana Cristina could see the shadows of Polo's feet under the door. He watched them in silence, whereas only weeks before, any time around his parents was usually filled with obsessive questions or outright complaints. For weeks, his father wanted to sit down and talk to him. Not to try to explain himself or justify what he did, but just to listen, to try and help his boy to understand what happened, what he endured. And for as much want for dialogue as Domingo had, he didn't have the strength to actually approach his son and speak. The shame that came from his cowardice, mingled with his guilt over leaving the boy, took a toll on Domingo. Soon, as if trying to atone by reliving the boy's suffering, he ate little and hardly slept. He'd stayed up for hours, the television going, though he wasn't really watching it. Ana Cristina kicked him out of the bedroom because the TV light gave her strange dreams. Domingo spent his nights in the living room, eyes open and mind shut inward.
I am rather busy.
On one such night, flipping through the channels, Domingo heard a whistling between the ebb and flow of programs. He followed the sound through the darkened house until he reached what he thought was the source. The whistling seemed to come from Polo's room. Domingo stood there a moment, knowing he should investigate, but was still too ashamed to brazenly approach his boy. After a moment, he decided to open the door just enough to look inside. Domingo found Polo standing at his open window, looking out into the night and whistling a familiar tune. Some theme song to one of his cartoons. Yet it wasn't the bored notes of a wandering mind. Polo made the sounds with a deliberateness that Domingo was not prepared to hear at that hour. Domingo watched him a minute, the boy whistling half a tune and then waiting before starting again. "What are you doing, son?" he asked. The suddenness and volume of his voice in the silent house made Domingo cringe, thinking he might frighten the boy again.
"I'm calling my friend, the bird lady,"
Polo said, not turning to look at his father. "Who's the bird lady?" Domingo asked from the doorway.
"She's the one who kept me safe,"
Polo said, finally looking at his father.
"She gave me back to you."
The next morning, while the boy ate cereal and toast and jam, Anna Christina questioned him about the bird lady. She too felt the guilt from the public scrutiny and her own conscience, and tried to broach any subject calmly and without accusation.
She sounded nice.
She added nervously.
I'd like to thank her for helping you.
Polo smiled, his mouth still full of cereal.
She was real nice.
He said.
She let me stay with her until you found me.
Why didn't she try to find us? Domingo asked softly. I'm sure you told her that we were looking for you. Polo looked at his father with a stare that seemed to scrutinize him beyond what a boy of his age was capable of.
But, Dad, I didn't know you were looking for me.
Domingo had to look away for a second.
When she heard all of the people going through the Monte, she told me to go to them.
Polo told them.
I told her to come with me, but she told me it was really important that I didn't tell anyone that she helped me.
You should have told us, Domingo said quickly, though he shrank away, expecting his son to recoil from his tone.
I know, Dad,
Polo said, the mention of Domingo's title working on the man like pleasant music.
But she made me promise not to tell anyone. She made me swear.
Anna Christina gave Domingo a look.
Why would she do that, honey? She says she doesn't like people. She likes babies and kids, but not people. That's why she only goes out at night. Did you find her house?
Anna Christina asked.
Is that how you met her? She found me,
the boy said.
It was dark and I was cold and hungry.
Each of the words out of his mouth made his parents feel as though weights were being lowered onto their necks.
And I was crying and it was dark. Dark. Then she whistled. She whistled, Dog Pound Detectives. I heard it and yelled, but she didn't come. She whistled again, so I whistled back. And then she came and got me and took me home. Did she tell you her name? Mommy and Daddy,
Anna Christina started.
She said names are secrets,
Polo said. Well, what did she look like? Domingo asked, inwardly berating himself.
A little, but...
Polo stopped to think a moment.
She looked like an old lady with feathers, and they were... Wait!
Polo scooted his chair out and went to his room. Anna Christina and Domingo huddled together, debating whether or not to press the boy, whether or not to call the police.
I drew a picture of her for when I see her again,
the boy announced, bringing a colored sheet of computer paper to the table.
See her again?
Anna Christina asked, taking the picture.
When? She said all I had to do was whistle and she'd hear me,
the boy said, beaming, unaware that his mother's face drained of color.
I hope she likes it.
Anna Christina passed the drawing to Domingo, and it nearly crushed his soul. The drawing was childlike, but Domingo imagined seeing such a person emerge from the Monte in the middle of the night. Her stark white hair fell all the way down past her waist, and framed an emaciated face comprised of a hawkish nose and jutting cheekbones. Her eyes were too large for her face, and for some reason Polo had colored them a golden yellow devoid of pupils. Her clothing seemed to be a jumble of feathers and filth, though Domingo told himself the ghastly features were due only to his son's lack of artistic talent.
Do you think she'll like it?
Polo asked. She'll love it, Domingo said, only half paying attention as though something of himself was being lost in the crayon yellow eyes. Domingo told the police about what his son had told him, but when they checked on the boy's story, the police said that no one lived on the property. It belonged to a development firm that was sitting on the piece of land until it was profitable to sell it. Any constructions on the land would have been destroyed and anyone living there would have been driven out a decade earlier. At first, the boy's parents weren't sure what to do with that information, but soon Domingo thought the story of the bird lady was only natural. The boy had been alone, lost, surrounded by dirt and thorns. He had been hungry and cold and delirious with fright. In times like that, Domingo felt he could understand the boy pretending there was some grandmotherly figure there to help him survive. But with those thoughts came the visions of his son huddled inches from snakes without tears left to shed, whistling to himself just to hear anything other than the oppressive silence of the monte. So, on those sleepless nights, Domingo excused the whistling. Each note he felt was like a sort of prayer to whatever powers allowed his son to survive. Some nights Domingo stood outside of the boy's door, listening to the half-tunes the boy sent out his window. He listened to them as though there was something important in those songs, something to be memorized and cherished. One such night, Domingo heard the whistling start up, and he crept to the door to listen to it. The little song started the same as they always did, a few bars followed by silence. He listened for a few minutes, but once the boy whistled for the 6th or 7th time, the boy stopped. After the silence, the boy said,
"Yay! I knew you'd come. I just had to keep calling."
The words wounded Domingo, knowing that the boy's imagination had saved his tiny psyche, not his father. At that moment, Domingo was filled with such a profound paternal instinct, he lost all his fear and hesitation, and wanted his whole being to open the door and embrace his son.
Claro, niño. Son amigos, no?
Domingo nearly fell when he heard the voice. The words couldn't have been made by his son, no matter how he altered his voice. The person who'd spoken sounded like an ancient woman, a speaker of a language the boy hardly knew. Domingo opened the door and was confronted by the maddening din of beaten wings filling the room with a rush of discordant sounds. But in an instant, there was silence. He opened his eyes to see Polo standing at the window, scowling playfully. All around him, black and white feathers drifted to the floor like a light snowfall.
"Dad,
He complained playfully.
you scare her away."
Domingo wanted to ask who, but landing at his feet, the crayon drawing with large yellow eyes told him the answer. The Halcons took their son back to the state psychologist to talk about the bird lady. But the doctors all said the same thing. The bird lady was a manifestation of the boy's imagination, a coping mechanism for the trauma of being left alone in the monte. When questioned about the strange voice, one doctor laughed and said,
The vocal cords are remarkable things. They can imitate all kinds of voices, and children have a tendency of playing with voices during their cartoon phases.
None of them had answers for the feathers. Domingo had collected them in a plastic bag and showed them to the doctors, some of whom, in their amateur opinions, didn't think they were the type found in pillows. Polo maintained the same story. The feathers, the voice, they were all from the old woman who helped him in the monte. She had only come to visit and see how he was doing now that he was back home. She heard him whistling.
"How does she get to your room?
Ana Cristina asked her son.
If she lives near the highway, does she drive?"
Polo thought the idea of the old woman driving was funny.
"No, Mom. She flies. She's got big wings like a bird and flies to my window."
Hearing this, Ana Cristina smiled and told Polo to go and play. She looked at her husband and sighed.
"It's all just in his head. You heard him. Bird lady's flying to his window. It's like the doctor said."
Then explain the feathers, Ana, Domingo told her.
"He could have picked them up out in the yard,"
Ana Cristina said.
"The Cueva's cat kills pigeons and crows all over the neighborhood."
Domingo listened to his wife's explanation and nodded, though he didn't believe a word of it. She hadn't been in the room. She hadn't heard the booming whoosh of titanic wings. But he could find no explanation that could make sense of what he had seen, and perhaps all those sleepless nights and weeks of stress confused him. It had been the middle of the night, and Domingo hadn't really seen anything. Still, like the guilt of leaving the boy, the thought that all the doctors and his wife were wrong nagged him. Alone, the only light coming from the TV, Domingo couldn't resign himself to believe any of it. He'd been there. But if it wasn't the boy's brain and his collection of feathers, if the boy told the truth, he'd been saved by an old woman with the wings of a bird. Engrossed in the fantastic idea, Domingo heard his son whistling in his room. At once he was filled with a mixture of dread and exhaustion. He laughed to himself and rubbed his face. Domingo went up to the boy's door, telling himself that it was how the boy survived, how he dealt with the memories of the elements and the dark, memories of a shitty father too impatient to do the right thing. No more, he thought. Domingo opened the door and found Polo at his open window. The boy did not seem surprised that his father was there. "Hey, son," Domingo said, walking up to the window. "You, trying to call the lady again?"
Uh-huh.
Polo said, nodding.
You've just got to whistle. If she whistles back, you answer, and she'll come.
Domingo smiled to hide the pain that came with the image of his son listening to the dark for a friend that would never come. "Can I do it too?" he asked.
Sure.
Polo said, excited. He pulled his father by the arm and set him at the open window. It looked out to their backyard with the cinder block fence hidden in shadow and all the undeveloped land behind it.
Go on, Dad.
The boy urged.
Whistle. Anything you want.
Polo said, smiling up at him. "All right. Let me think," Domingo said. Thinking of one, Domingo whistled the tune of an old radio commercial for a Chinese buffet. Hearing it made him smile a bit. After a moment of silence, Polo told him to do it again, saying that she never answers after the first time. Domingo whistled again, his ear trained to the night air. But there was nothing. A part of him somehow was disappointed, yet the majority of him told Domingo that it was proof that all this late-night whistling was nothing to worry about. There were stranger ways to cope. As though in affirmation of this, Domingo whistled into the dark again and basked in the silence. Faintly, he heard a bird song. A tune for a Chinese buffet closed for 20 years. Domingo froze at the sound. Again, logic tried to flood his mind, tried to tell him that it was nothing, a strange mingling of the boy's playful imaginings and Domingo's newfound relief. Polo tugged at his father's arm.
You've got to answer, Dad,
the boy told him. Domingo hesitated. He let out some of the tune, and the silence that followed it had a weight, a presence. It was herald to something Domingo felt. He looked out at the dark yard, over at the dark sky, thinking he might see some hint of movement. Nothing. Within seconds, Domingo relaxed, thinking again it was his son's imagination that affected his own. He trained his eyes on the dark to prove it once more to himself. Smiling, he looked down at his son and tousled his hair.
Look, there she is.
Domingo snapped his head up, and the scream bubbling inside him was caught in his throat. What came out of the shadows did not look human. Shaggy with feathers, it had a hunchback that hid its face in shadow, and it lumbered forward as though it shouldered a great weight. Yet it moved silently, its footfalls unseen beneath the shroud of black feathers. As if sensing Domingo's fright, the thing approaching them let glow its eyes, huge yellow discs that even devoid of pupils, Domingo felt them focus on him. Their light gave the thing's face deep contours, and the wrinkled skin looked like tattoos carved by uncaring hands. Domingo got a hold of his son, shut the window, and walked backward slowly, keeping his eyes on the dark outside. Never had the boy's room, or any room for that matter, felt so vast to him than in that moment. Still, Domingo didn't run, didn't shout. Somehow, he thought, doing so would spark an outrage within that figure creeping towards their home. As his back bumped against the door, the figure appeared at the window. All dark hunchback and bright yellow eyes, the figure's face glowed against the glass. It smiled wide, revealing a toothless mouth. Up came its hand, its palm and fingers human, but the nails were the talons of a bird. The figure tapped on the window, calling,
Niño, abra la ventana. Por favor, mijo.
The boy tried to pull away from his father, but Domingo wouldn't let him go.
Dad,
He whined.
she wants to come inside. She's my friend. Please let her in.
Be quiet, Domingo hissed, grabbing the boy tighter. Go to your mother. Tell her to call the police.
But, Dad,
Don't argue with me, Domingo barked. Now go! The boy's struggle ceased and deflated. He sighed and slowly went to the hall. Alone in the boy's room, Domingo stared at the withered face, which still smiled with an unwavering consistency at him. Meeting eyes with it, Domingo had to fight to get even the fewest words out. Leave, he told it. This is my house. He is my son. Leave us alone. The figure put a second claw against the glass, scratching at it slowly. Get away from here, Domingo shouted. The bluster in his voice sounded forced and pathetic. You're not wanted here. You...
me llamaste. Y yo le respondí.
Stay away from us, Domingo wanted to say, but as the words formed on his tongue, that slow figure outside his window crashed through the glass. Domingo shouted, throwing up his hands in some vain attempt to defend himself. Great wings battered his head and body, and the maelstrom of motion confused and frightened him. He felt his fists connect against the feathered body of what felt like solid mesquite. But despite the crunches of his fingers and knuckles, Domingo didn't dare relent. In an instant, Domingo felt those taloned fingers hook into his shoulders, the wounds immediately searing with pain. His body locked as he screamed, and as suddenly as he had been caught, Domingo was pulled off his feet with such a force, he thought he had been ripped in half. He was still intact, though, no longer in his son's room. Domingo was flying up into the night sky, blood dripping on the land rushing by below him, serenaded by the hacking laughter of an old woman with the wings of a bird. The police arrived and searched the house. Domingo Halcon was gone. Polo's room was a mess of broken furniture and shards of glass and blood. Again, Domingo was in the news, except now he was missing. Search parties were formed, posters and flyers printed. A week later, animal control was called. Vultures were picking at something large and stinking by the highway. What they found was a body, shattered and mangled, in a small crater of its own making. The coroner examined it. The wallet retrieved had Domingo Halcon's driver's license in it, and found that the injuries were consistent with a fall from over 50 feet, though there was no structure of that height within miles of the body and, as far as the police could tell, no planes passed over that area. The coroner noted that the eyes, the tongue, and some teeth were missing, but they wrote it off as results of vultures.
Chapter 1. Eli was startled by the sound of a key in the front door. He had been resting in the upstairs bedroom. He couldn't sleep anymore and hadn't been able to do so in weeks. He missed it. He hadn't left the house in weeks either, so he was missing many things right now. He listened as the door opened, and then he quietly crept into the closet, leaving the door ajar. He squeezed as far back into the corner as he was able, slid down the wall, and sat with his knees pulled up to his chest, his arms wrapped tightly around his legs. Then he waited. He could hear footsteps downstairs, crossing from the living room through the dining area and into the kitchen, where the intruder began opening and closing cabinet doors. When he used to get anxious, he would feel his heart rate quicken. His breathing would become shallow, and his palms would feel damp with sweat. Now it feels different. Now it is as though he spent most of his time in a fog, and when something made him anxious, he simply felt more alert. The fog would lift, and things would appear more clearly. The soft focus would become dialed in, and he could see color and sharp edges. He realized that the intruder was now coming up the stairs. The footsteps were light and feminine. It was a woman. He could smell her before she entered the room. Even though he wasn't breathing, the scent still clung to his nostrils. It was clean and sweet, lavender and vanilla. He closed his eyes and let it soak in. It brought back memories of his wife that were so intense that he could almost feel her warm body next to his. He felt the cool darkness of a shadow across the door opening and was shaken from his reverie. He opened his eyes and was so stunned that his mouth dropped open and he stared at her. She stood at the opening of the closet and seemed to look right through him. She was exquisite, petite and slender, with dark shoulder-length wavy hair tucked behind her ears and warm hazel eyes that were brown around her pupils, blending into green. Her phone rang loudly, and he jumped as she turned away to answer it. "Hello? Yes, this is Becca. Oh, hi. I'm in the house right now, actually. Yeah, I didn't have any trouble with the lockbox. Oh my God, I love it. It's perfect. I want to make a bid before anyone else sees it." Her voice faded as she exited the room and made her way down the stairs. Eli crawled out of the closet and stood up. He felt foolish for hiding in his panic. He knew that she would not have been able to see him. No one can see the dead. Chapter 2. Eli could remember the last time he heard feminine feet padding up the stairs. He didn't know how long it had been, though. He no longer had any feeling for the passage of time. Caitlin had come into the room, sat on the edge of the bed, and gently laid her cool, dry hand on his forehead. It took every bit of strength he had to open his eyes. She smiled, took his hand, and said, "Hey, look who's awake." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she smiled at him. He tried to open his lips to speak, but they were dry, and he had to peel them apart. He was so dehydrated that his tongue was stuck to the roof of his mouth. He still had canker sores from his chemotherapy, and just moving his mouth that tiny bit proved painful. He grimaced. "Let me get you some ice chips," she said as she started to stand, but Eli squeezed her hand tightly and held her there. He swallowed, trying to moisten his mouth enough to talk, his voice coming out in a gravelly whisper. "No, stay, please." She nodded her head, and the tears that she had been holding back began to roll down her cheeks. He tilted his chin up and to the side, which she knew meant that he wanted her to lie beside him with her face nuzzled into the crook of his neck. Her warmth comforted him, and he tried to stay awake and savor it, but he was so very sleepy that he couldn't keep his eyelids open, and soon he drifted off. He woke to the sound of Caitlin crying. He had become accustomed to her quiet sobbing, but this was different. This was a high-pitched keening that sounded almost like an animal. He felt different. He realized that the intense pain that had been his constant companion since before his diagnosis of pancreatic cancer was gone, as was his weakness and fatigue. He sat up and looked at her as she stood stooped over beside the bed with one hand across her stomach and the other over her mouth, and said in a clear voice, "Caitlin, it's okay. I'm okay. Kate, please, listen to me." But she didn't even glance in his direction. She kept staring down at the bed where he had been lying, and she began to speak, saying, No. I'm not ready. I need more time. No, please." He turned to look at what had drawn her attention, and it didn't make any sense. It was him. He was lying on his back with his dry, cracked mouth open in a surprised O, with his eyes open and unseeing. He could only stare at the scene in disbelief, wondering how on earth this could be happening. How could he be looking at his own dead body? How? Eli didn't believe in ghosts. Chapter 3. Eli spent the first hours after his death trying to let Caitlin know he was there. She couldn't hear him speak. She couldn't see him. She couldn't feel him. He even tried running past her, waving his arms, but he couldn't even move the air. He was without substance. All he could do was watch her weep. He followed her as she made phone calls to tell people he had died. He watched her kiss his forehead and hold his hand one last time. He stood by and watched them take his body away. She began packing the next morning. Her parents and her brother came to help. She said she just couldn't live there without him. "I'm here, Kate. I'm still here," he said over and over. He watched as the house got emptier and emptier. He tried to go outside and follow them to the truck, but when he got to the open door, something stopped him. He couldn't move past the threshold. It was as if he was tethered to the house. There was no physical barrier that he could see. He was simply unable to get out the door. After everyone else left, Caitlin took one last walk through each room, touching door frames and windows, and he followed, knowing that this was the last time he would ever see her again. She stopped at the front door and turned back into the room. She closed her eyes, swallowed, and said, "Goodbye, Eli." He was so overcome with despair that he felt an ache in his chest. He ran to her and tried to wrap her in his arms. Her eyes flew open and she gasped and shivered. "Eli?" Yes, I'm here," he said. She just shook her head, turned, and walked out the door. Chapter 4. Eli sits across the table from Becca, watching her eat a clementine. What he wouldn't give to do that one more time. If he were alive again, he would never take an experience like that for granted. He imagines the weight of the fruit in his hand. He can almost feel the smooth, shiny texture of the peel. He pictures himself using his fingernail to pry up the corner of the sticker and tugging it, feeling the resistance as it let go and came away from the skin of the fruit. He imagines rolling it into a tiny tube that he continues to work between his finger and thumb before sticking it to a paper towel that is laid out in front of him. He sees himself poking the tip of his thumb into the top, popping a hole in the skin and pulling it back with ease. He used to try to get it off in one piece, and he would look at his thumb and see the orange stain under his short nail. He could smell the sweet citrus perfume that used to make his jaw hurt a little, thinking of the tartness of it as his mouth watered, pulling off the little strings that remained stuck to the fruit after the peel was gone. He missed everything about being alive. Now he passed his time following Becca around the house when she was there and waiting for her when she wasn't. At first he felt intrusive and creepy, and he would leave the room when she was undressing or showering. But being dead was lonely, and frankly, it was also incredibly boring. Eli was bored as hell. He finally gave in and began staying in the room no matter what she was doing. He didn't watch her undress and bathe because it aroused him. He did it because watching her do normal things, watching her live her life, made him feel alive. He followed her everywhere in the house like a devoted dog. He watched her undress and shower. He watched her brush her teeth. He watched her eat. He watched her watch television. She was far more interesting to him than what was happening on the screen. He had even begun crawling into bed with her, lying next to her, watching her sleep at night. When she would leave the house, he would sit at the top of the stairs and let the fog settle in until she returned, and there was clarity again. Eli was obsessed with her. She was his life. Chapter 5. Eli stood at the edge of the kitchen watching Becca pour ground sausage crumbles into a colander, draining the fat and water into a bowl. She put it back on the stove and popped open a jar of sauce and poured it in, giving it a stir. She checked to see if the water was boiling yet, then poured some salt into her hand and sprinkled it in. The activity was mesmerizing. She never cooked like this. She typically brought home styrofoam containers of takeout from local restaurants. He loved it when she brought home shepherd's pie from Llewellyn's pub down the street. If he closed his eyes and let the smell drift into his nose, he was taken back to the bustling little dining area. He could almost taste the malty, bittersweet coffee flavors in the Guinness he always ordered. He heard the doorbell ring and saw her grab a kitchen towel and wipe her hands as she hurried to the door. She opened it, and there stood a woman who looked very similar to her, but a little heavier and a little older. She was carrying a small boy. "There he is!" she shouted gleefully. "Come to Auntie Becca." He reached his hands straight out and fell toward her from his mother's arms. She grabbed him in a hug and said, "I made your favorite." "Paschetti!" he yelled, and both women laughed. Eli couldn't help but smile himself. He hadn't seen people this joyful for a very long time. Even the last few weeks of his life here with Caitlin weren't spent truly living. They were spent dying, and there is very little joy to be found in that. They continued to fawn over the boy until he wiggled and grunted to be put down. He immediately ran out of the room with his mother chasing him. Becca finished cooking dinner, set the table, and yelled, "Kara, Jack, it's Paschetti time." They came in and sat at the table, and Eli stood back and watched. Jack held his small spoon in one hand and ate handfuls of spaghetti with the other, cramming his little fistful of noodles into his mouth. He suddenly stopped, looked up at Eli, and stared without blinking, food forgotten. Eli was stunned. He held up his hand and gave a small wave. Jack uncurled his fingers and waved back. He could see him. Could he hear him too? "Hi." Jack smiled and said, "Hi." Both women looked at him in confusion, laughed, and Kara said, "Well, hi to you too," and went back to her dinner. Eli slowly put his hands over his face, then pulled them away quickly and said, "Peekaboo." Jack laughed, and it made Eli smile. Becca and Kara stopped talking, and Kara said, "What's so funny?" Jack pointed at Eli. Both women turned to look and saw nothing. Kara looked confused and said, "The wall? Is the wall funny?" Eli again covered his face with his hands and did it again. "Peekaboo." Jack laughed even harder this time and yelled, "Peekaboo." Becca stopped laughing and nervously asked, What do you see, Jack? Kara said, "Becca, for crying out loud, it's probably an imaginary friend. That's totally normal." Becca shook her head. "No, Kara, it's not. That is not normal for a 2-year-old. Jack, what do you see, sweetie?" Jack pointed at Eli and said, "Him." "Him? Him who? Who is him? Is someone there, Jack?" Jack tilted his head to the side and stared at Eli. Eli pointed at his chest and said, "My name is Eli." Jack looked at Becca and said, "Him Ey." She just stared for a moment, then she said, "Ey? Eli? Did you say his name is Eli, sweetie?" Jack nodded his head, pointed back at Eli, and, "Ey peekaboo." She turned to her sister and said, "Who is Eli? Does he have a friend named Eli? Is there anyone you know named Eli?" Kara just shook her head no and looked at the blank wall that Jack was staring at. "Jack," Becca said, "who is Eli? Who are you playing peekaboo with?" Jack looked to Eli for help answering the question, so he said, "This is my house. I lived here. I died in this house." Jack turned to his aunt and said, "Him house, him die." Then he put his little hands over his face, pulled them away, and yelled, "Peekaboo, Ey, peekaboo." Chapter 6. Eli sat and watched the computer screen as Becca was doing research to see if she could find him. It didn't take long for her to find his obituary. It was so strange to read about his own death as she quietly read the words aloud. "Elias Jonathan Schaefer passed away at home on March 20, 2020, at the age of 42 after a courageous battle with cancer, with his wife Caitlin at his side." She stopped reading and looked over at the wall where Jack had seen him. She nervously said, "Eli, are you here?" Eli walked over to the area she was looking at and answered, "Yes," hoping that perhaps now that she knew about him, she might be able to at least feel him there. It had felt so good to be able to interact with Jack, to be seen, to be heard. He needed that. He needed the connection he felt to another human being. She seemed to be staring directly at him when her phone rang and she screamed, put her hand to her chest, and laughed to herself before she answered. "Hey, Kara. Oh my God. I looked up the previous owners and found his obituary. He died of cancer here in the house. I know, right? I'm completely freaked out. I have always thought ghosts were a load of bullshit." "You think you're freaked out? Try being a ghost when you used to think it was bullshit," Eli said. She pulled up Facebook and searched for his name. "Okay, I've got his Facebook page here. Oh my God, Kara. It's so sad." Eli looked over her shoulder at his profile picture. It was taken before the cancer diagnosis, back when he was healthy and happy. In the picture, he was sitting at a tall outdoor table at Llewellyn's with a pint of Guinness in one hand and his other arm around Caitlin. He was smiling, and she was looking up at him. The memory made him ache, and he felt even more empty than he had before. "He was so young and handsome," she said. Eli smiled. "Thanks. I wonder if there's something I can do to help him move on." He quickly dropped his smile. "Move on? Move on? Where?" he asked out loud. "Where am I supposed to go? I can't get out of here. I can't leave." The ache he had been feeling deep in his chest was expanding in his torso and moving up into his head. He felt alive. He could feel, and even though it hurt, he wanted to hang on to it because it was the first time his body had felt a real physical sensation since his death. He was devastated, scared, and angry, and it was so strong it gave him energy. He looked down at the computer screen, and Becca had clicked on Caitlin's Facebook page. They used to have matching profile photos, but Caitlin had changed hers. Now her profile photo showed her smiling at the camera with a strange man who had his arm around her waist, and she leaned into him with her hand on his chest. The ache that Eli felt became sharp and filled his entire body. He collapsed to his knees on the floor, threw back his head, and howled in agony. The light bulb in the fixture above the table exploded, and the laptop shut down. Becca shrieked and ran out of the house. Eli went to the window and watched her standing in the front yard staring at the house and crying while still on the phone with Kara. He knew she would be back. She had to come back. At the very least, she would have to pick up her things. He would have to try to be on his best behavior when she did come back because he had lost Caitlin and he couldn't lose Becca too. He wouldn't lose Becca. "Come on, Becca," Eli murmured. "I can't let you leave. I need you. Come back home." Chapter 7. For 2 days, Eli sat at the top of the steps in a fog waiting for Becca to come home. She finally came back, clutching a flat box to her chest. He followed her upstairs to the bedroom, where she laid the box on the bed and opened it. It was a Ouija board. He chuckled to himself at the thought of her trying a Ouija board. He had heard a story on NPR about the lengths that people would go in order to talk to the dead. The man being interviewed saw it as a bit of a joke. He believed the board merely gave the user a glimpse into their own psyche. "This is absolutely ridiculous," said Eli. Becca pulled the board out and laid the planchette in the center of it and said, "I have never felt more ridiculous in my life." Eli stood across the room from her, watching and waiting to see what questions she asked. She took a deep, shaky breath and said, "Eli, are you here?" To his complete and utter shock, Eli began being pulled toward the board. He had no control over his movements at all. His hands were held out in front of him with his arms straight, as if he were being pulled over by his fingers. He floated over to the edge of the bed and dropped down to a sitting position with his fingertips on the planchette. He could feel it. His fingertips were on the teardrop-shaped wooden piece nearly touching her fingers, and he could absolutely feel it. Without any forethought, in fact, in his shock, he had forgotten that she had even asked the question, he began moving the piece toward the word yes. Becca gasped and moved her hands off the planchette, and Eli was able to move his hands away too. She sat staring at the board, breathing hard for a few moments. She gathered herself and put her fingers back on it, moving it to a neutral position. Okay, so you're here. Okay. My God, this is insane. So, I'm sorry that you're dead. Eli felt no pull toward the board, and when he tried to put his fingers on the planchette to reply, he could no longer feel it. What the hell? She looked puzzled and then said, Oh, that's right. It has to be a question. Okay, where did you die in the house? The feeling came back to his fingers, and as he was debating whether to tell her that he died in this room because he didn't want to scare her any more than she was already scared, his fingers began sliding to the first letter. R-I-G-H-T-H-E-R-E. Right here? Becca said quietly. Right here in this room? Eli was desperate to move his hands away. If he continued to scare her, she would be gone forever. He would lose her too, but he couldn't stop himself. He couldn't lie, and he couldn't refuse to answer. The planchette moved to yes. Becca pulled her hands back as if she had just touched a hot stove. She jumped off the bed and backed away, trying to regain her composure while Eli watched helplessly. He felt the small knot of ache begin in his chest. Don't go. Please don't go, he begged. Becca sat back down, put her fingertips on the planchette, and said, Is there something I can do to help you move on? The planchette moved to no. Becca started to whimper in fear. I need you to go, she said. Then she shook her head and said, Can you go? Can you leave here? The planchette moved to no. She was crying as she asked, Why? Why can't you just leave? Eli wanted to say he didn't know why. He wanted to say that he promised he would leave her alone, that he would be quiet, and she wouldn't even know he was there. But all he could do was move the planchette as his ache grew larger and larger. M-I-N-E. Mine? Becca whispered. You are staying because the house is yours? Yes. Do you want me to leave? No. Becca got up and started walking backward toward the bedroom door, saying, Look, Eli, I am sorry that this is happening, but I don't know what to do. I can't live here like this. I have to go. The ache had bloomed throughout his body again, and he felt like he was vibrating. He was frustrated with his inability to communicate through the Ouija board, angry and scared that she was leaving, but with all the overwhelming emotion and pain, he finally felt alive. He felt like he could stop her. He stood and moved toward her. Will you please leave? Becca asked from across the room. Eli was immediately jerked back to the board. His fingers moved to the planchette to no. They both stared at the board in disbelief, and Becca said, I have to go. No! Eli raged, and the planchette flew across the room, slamming into the wall. Becca turned and ran toward the stairs. Eli gave a deep guttural scream and flew into the hallway after her. He overtook her, and she could feel his energy. She turned to glance over her shoulder, eyes wide with terror as he threw himself at her. She was pummeled by a cold wave, and her feet flew out from under her. Eli watched as she went horizontal and landed on her head about halfway down. Then she flipped like a rag doll onto her back, rolled, and ended up face down on the floor at the bottom of the stairs. Chapter 8. Becca woke confused, taking inventory of the wounds she knew she would have from the fall. She was surprised at how good she felt for someone who had taken such a tumble. She rolled from her belly onto her side and sat up. She remembered her fear and got to her feet and started toward the front door when she heard an unfamiliar voice behind her. Becca? She froze for a moment and slowly turned around, and there was a man sitting at the top of the stairs. She recognized him from his Facebook page, but it made no sense. Eli? She said. Eli nodded his head. "Oh, God," Becca whispered. "Does that mean I'm—" Eli smiled and nodded. He raised an eyebrow and looked down. She followed his gaze and saw her broken body lying on the floor, eyes still wide with fear, her head facing the wrong direction. "This can't be happening," she said as she turned and ran to the front door. But when she grabbed for the doorknob, her hand passed through it. She looked back at Eli in horror. "Welcome home, Becca."
Every town has the place. An abandoned building, an alleyway, a wooded area, where the bad kids hang out. You know who I mean. The long hairs, metalheads, the druggies. It's where these outsiders go to smoke cigarettes and listen to music. For us, it was the bridge over Boot Creek, the little stream that snaked through town. Boot Creek itself was rarely any more than a muddy ditch, but at the top of the bank there was an area where kids could hang out and make noise and ride their skateboards without the nosy gazes of adults. My friends and I took to calling it Troll Bridge because it was occupied almost all the time by Billy Logan and his crew of pothead screw-ups. Billy was 3 years older than us, but was only 1 grade ahead because he'd been held back twice. I was in the 7th grade, and here was this giant 15-year-old bully running around terrorizing everyone. Don't look so shocked. It was the 80s. Things were just like that. It was a different world back then. Anyway, Billy had grown this sort of scraggly goatee on his chin, and my friend Chad remarked that all that hanging out under the bridge was turning him into a billy goat. My other friend Daniel pointed out that it had been the troll who lived under the bridge, not the goats. I agreed with Daniel that Billy was much more like the troll than the goats. And after that, it was Troll Bridge, not Boot Creek, that we avoided as much as we could. Now, like I said, this was the 80s and things were different back then. Westport is still a tiny town, but back then it wasn't much more than a few cross streets, some churches, the schools, and a few neighborhoods. It was the sort of town that it was really big news, like front page, that they were opening a new gas station on 5th Street. So in the 80s, I lived in a town that was still very much like the idyllic American towns they showed in TV shows from the 50s. The people were pretty religious and very patriotic. There were community events and boosters, and on the 4th of July, everyone in town would drag a cooler to the beach to watch the fireworks display out over the bay. There were no kidnappers or drug cartels, no perverts or traffickers. There was nothing to be afraid of in Westport, except for maybe Satan. But you know, it was the 80s. Everyone was scared of the devil back then. So when it came to things for me to be afraid of, it was pretty much Satan and Billy Logan. And although we were all pretty scared of the devil, Billy Logan was someone we saw every day. The thing was, although he was a giant asshole and I was terrified of the guy, I stood in awe of Billy Logan. Here was a guy who did whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Billy dressed in nothing but ripped jeans, black heavy metal t-shirts, and combat boots. His hair was working on being long, with the back hanging somewhat longer than the front. You'd call it a mullet now, but back then, it was what metalhead kids did between figuring out they wanted long hair and actually having it. Occasionally, I'd see him riding around town on his bike, a tweaked-out BMX with mix-and-match parts. Always leaning back, riding without hands, smoking a cigarette. He was always sure to use the other hand to give you the finger if he saw you looking. Now, I realize bullies are created by being bullied, and that the story of Billy Logan was probably a horribly tragic one, full of neglectful parents and cries for help. I know this. Part of me knew it then, too. You had to know this sort of thing was not normal. that kids just didn't go around failing grades and being assholes because they were just naturally that cool. I realized that he probably had a terrible home life and was just acting out. And teachers? If I had to bet what the teachers were all talking about most of the time in that tiny, smoke-filled teacher's lounge, it was Billy Logan. He'd already been left back twice. There was no way this kid was going to college. Any decent grade he made was, in all likelihood, a sympathy mark, if he even bothered to show up for class. So the teachers more or less left him alone, and for what it's worth, he obviously didn't have parents breathing down his neck all the time. Like some throwback version of Tyler Durden, he was free in all the ways I was not. And I craved that freedom. Another reason I took a shine to Billy Logan was because of the way Amy Martin looked at him the day he rode his skateboard through the cafeteria at lunchtime. I'd had a crush on Amy since the 5th grade and had nearly gotten up the nerve to ask her to the dance before hearing through the grapevine that she'd already been asked. Amy had an older brother that kept her informed of what was cool. She knew about music and books that we'd never heard of before. She had this sort of maturity, this sophistication that set her apart from the other girls in class. She was also really, really pretty. So brave or not, I knew chances were slim that I'd ever have a shot at a date with her. I was standing in the line with Chad and Daniel when the door to the cafeteria slammed open with a loud bang. Startled, everyone turned to see what had happened. There was Billy, riding his board, hands raised in the heavy metal devil horn salute. He coasted to the center of the room and did a 360-degree spin before stopping and kicking the board into his hand. He looked around dramatically, and in his best Geoff Spicoli voice said, "Hey, there's no birthday party for me here." Everybody laughed and watched as Billy began to make his way to the exit, being flanked on both sides by angry lunchroom monitors. He faked left and bolted right, slipping just under Coach Holden's reaching fingers, and then kicked open the door to the courtyard. When he realized he was free, he stuck a middle finger in the air before hitting that final door that opened to the parking lot. As the door swung shut, we could hear him cackling as he ran away. The cafeteria was abuzz with excitement. Billy had been bad before, but nobody had ever done something so outright crazy. Some people were shaking their heads in exasperation. Others were discussing how the school might go about punishing him when he came back on Monday. One thing's for certain. The only thing anyone was talking about was Billy Logan and the stunt he'd just pulled. Chad and Daniel guessed he'd finally be expelled, and we would be over the terror of Troll Bridge. I wasn't listening to any of it. You see, I'd only been watching Billy out of the corner of my eye. When he'd entered the room, I'd been sneaking glances at Amy Martin. I'd seen her reaction to his antics, and her reaction was anything but exasperation, anger, or pity. No, hers was a serious interest. I realized that she was watching him like I was watching her. Amy liked Billy Logan. She must have felt me watching her because she turned to look at me. I turned away for a second and looked back. Amy was watching Billy again. I decided then and there that I needed to be friends with Billy Logan. Somehow, I thought, he could show me how to be cool and whimsical and free like he was. Girls like bad boys? Fine. I was going to learn from the baddest of them all. The following Friday, when Chad invited me and Daniel over to his house after school, I declined, saying my dad was making me do a bunch of chores. What I really had planned was to head down to Troll Bridge and see if I could borrow a cigarette from Billy. Now, I want you to realize I wasn't lonely or weird or nerdy or any of those things. Although I probably was all those things without being aware of it. Most of my class had been together since kindergarten, and everyone's parents knew each other. There weren't any real out-groups at our little school. There simply weren't enough students for that. But that was the thing. Everyone was so boringly normal that any deviation was just so incredibly interesting. I wonder sometimes if Billy's antics would have been received in the same way at a larger school in a city somewhere. Our school, it seemed, was just unable to deal with a delinquent like him. And whether it was good or bad, it got everyone's attention. Me? If I ever tried to pull anything even sort of silly, my folks would have my ass. My dad was former military and super strict. He had traveled the world and knew more than all the pansies out there. There was one correct way to do everything, and anything other than that way was not only wrong, but almost personally insulting to him somehow. He was a man of very few words, who always had his nose in a book, and most of the time that book was the Bible. My mother was also quite strict and Spartan, if not just a little gentler than my dad. And hell, I'm probably not even being fair. Mom used to tell me that Dad had a hard time during the war, that he'd seen horrible things that he couldn't even talk about. So, I guess they were doing the best they could with what they had. They were strict as hell, though. Even in our tiny town where nothing ever happened and nothing ever went wrong, I had a 7 o'clock curfew, 8 on weekends. I had to call and check in all the time, and when friends were getting together for sleepovers or campouts, I was almost never allowed to go. Even when I was allowed, Mom would have to call and check and double-check with everybody's parents before I got permission. As elementary school gave way to junior high, I had expected the shackles to be loosened a bit, but so far, no such luck. I was wrapped just as tightly in parental supervision as I'd ever been, and every day, my resentment was growing. As I watched Billy burst out of those doors with his middle finger in the air, as I watched a kid flaunt complete and total disregard for authority and rules and parents, and pretty much everything else, and, well, just walk away scot-free. I had to be part of this. I had to find out how he did it. I needed to know how not to give a shit. Not in the way that everyone else did. I needed to be Billy Logan's friend. I needed to be a badass who didn't give a fuck what people thought. I needed to find out what went on under that goddamned bridge. The following Friday, I said goodbye to my friends with as much false sincerity as I could muster. Yes, it sucked so much. Yeah, it was going to be hot and stupid. But that was Dad and his arbitrary chore assignment. Yeah, I'd see everyone on Monday. Well, unless I saw them at church, but yeah, see you Monday. I hitched my backpack up and headed across the football field and through the alley behind the grocery store. I stopped there to buy a soft drink for the bridge, then decided to grab a second, just in case Billy wanted one. It was a strange walk out to Boot Creek Bridge. I no longer wanted to think of it as Troll Bridge, now that I was going to be one of its occupants. We weren't bad people. We were just misunderstood. We liked music and skateboards, and there wasn't anything wrong with that. Did we like beer and cigarettes? Well, admittedly, I'd had neither. But hell yeah, we smoked and drank. It was just what we did, and if you didn't like it, you could just go on home. I imagined myself, dressed in ripped jeans and black t-shirt, playing guitar in a band, while Billy screamed to the world that heavy metal had landed in Westport, and everyone who didn't like it could fuck off. I actually played air guitar as I walked across the video store parking lot. This was real. This was going to happen. I just need to get and learn to play a guitar, and we'd be on MTV by this time next year. I crossed over 7th and made my way onto Country Road 9. I'd made sure to stay far to the side to keep from getting hit by the crazies who treated 9 as their own private racetrack. It wasn't far, only a couple hundred yards to the bridge. I'd crossed it hundreds of times on my way to and from school. There was nothing special or interesting or scary about it. Except this was Troll Bridge. Billy Gruff Troll Logan was under there, and I had come to meet him. I had come to face the monster. And not only that, I was going to try and tame him enough to make friends with me, to play heavy metal, a subject I knew the square root of fuck all about. Under there was a kid who shined off teachers and parents alike. Grown-ups had nothing on him. All of their power, strength, and authority meant nothing. The monster under the bridge was beyond the control of any adult, and adults were the place where kids like me placed all their hope and trust to keep things safe and normal. Billy Logan spit on all that and laughed at everyone's attempts to even try. And here I was, with an extra can of Dr. Pepper, and thinking I'd be able to tame the beast. I hesitated at the place where the asphalt met the dirt, and clustered sticker burrs swayed in the southeast Texas breeze. What the hell was I thinking? I leaned on the guardrail and thought back over my plan. I would go down there, act like life had just been too much to bear, and pretend like I was supposed to be there. If there was any conversation, I'd just shake my head and pretend like my problems were just too much to talk about. I would ask for a cigarette, then lean against the wall and talk to Billy Logan, man to man. Once we got to talking, I'd go for the gold. Rambo was the biggest movie at the time, and it just so happened that my uncle had taken my cousin Thomas and me to see it. Afterward, on the way through the mall to his car, we stopped into the knife store, and he bought us both official Rambo survival knives. I remember being so excited on the drive home. Thomas and I sitting in the back seat, comparing identical blades. It was nearly a foot long, with a sharp blade on one side, and a saw or something on the other. The handle had a compass on the end, and you could unscrew it to get all the cool stuff hidden inside. There were fish hooks and sewing needles, a handful of matches and a strike strip, some fishing line and thread for the needle. The sheath even had a compartment in front for a little blue sharpening stone. When I had this knife, I felt prepared for anything. Well, anything except for my father. When we got home that day, I left my new knife on the back seat of my uncle's car. Thomas and I ran to the backyard while my uncle talked to my dad. I have no idea what they talked about, except that a while after they left, Dad came into my room holding my survival knife and said we needed to talk.
"Son,"
he said, scratching the bridge of his nose.
"Your Uncle Darren told me he bought you and Thomas a present."
I just looked at him before shrugging. He looked uncomfortable.
"It's just that."
He paused and looked around, anywhere but at me.
"It's that I think a boy needs a good knife. I'd been meaning to get you one myself."
Shocked, I turned to him. "So, it's all right?" His normally serious gaze turned to a smile.
"Of course it is. I just want to make sure you know how to use it. A knife, any knife, but especially one as big as this one, needs to be treated with respect. Can I trust you to keep it clean and sharp and put away when it's not in use?"
"Yes, sir." I hopped up off the bed and gave him a hug. And to my surprise, he hugged me back.
"I'm serious, son,"
he said again.
"The fastest way you'll get into trouble is to go around doing stupid things with stupid people. I want that knife either on your belt or on the top shelf of your closet. Do not take it anywhere you could get into trouble for it. No school, no church, no nothing. You can use it here in the backyard, and that's about it. Okay? We'll go camping soon, and you can do what you like, but until then, please keep it put away. Okay?
I had been shocked, but also just so damn happy. It had been the first time I could think of that my old man spoke to me like I was a man, and not some little kid. I kept my word, too. I'd kept it on the shelf when I wasn't camping. It was the least I could do to keep my prize. Today, however, I had gone the other way. Today, that knife was stuffed between the soda cans in the front pocket of my backpack. Today, if soft drinks and small talk didn't work, I would prove to Billy that I could be cool. After all, only cool people would have a knife like mine, right? Or rather, only cool people would have the nerve to carry it around in their backpack at school. I would show him the knife, and he would think I was cool. And I'd be allowed into the gang, and that would be that. It couldn't fail. I hesitated a moment before hitching up my pack and walking down the sandy embankment on the side of the bridge. Just a few feet off the road, in a spot that was not visible from up there, were many layers of spray paint in different colors. I couldn't make out what most of it said, as it was painted over itself and nearly impossible to read. There were the names of bands, such as Slayer and Iron Maiden, among others. Most of these I failed to recognize. Further down, the graffiti got heavier, and I could make out swastikas and little phrases that I imagined were song lyrics. Among these phrases, more prominent than the others, were the phrases, "Hail Satan," and "God is dead." For whatever reason, the "Hail Satan" message didn't bother me, but "God is dead" gave me pause. Not for the first time, I thought I was making a mistake, and should just turn and go home.
"The hell are you?"
A voice called from under the bridge. I took a few more steps, then followed the voice. Billy Logan was sitting against the concrete embankment, smoking a cigarette and reading a magazine. To say he looked surprised to see me was an understatement. He regarded me carefully.
"Who's with you? What do you want?"
"Nobody's with me. I came by myself." I sighed and tried to play cool. "It's just been one of those days. Teachers all on my ass. Needed to come and think." Billy just watched me as I walked around considering the graffiti. He set his magazine down and leaned forward, his arms hugging his knees, then stood up slowly. I didn't know what to make of him moving like that. He almost seemed like a cat ready to pounce. I'd expected him to say something, but he didn't. This wasn't going well. I gestured to his cigarette. "Mind if I get one of those?" He exhaled a giant plume of smoke through his nose before reaching into his shirt pocket and tossing me a stick. Of course, it fell short, and I had to walk over to pick it up. I looked at it for a second, then put it between my lips. I then patted my pockets as if looking for a lighter we both knew I didn't have. "Got a light?" Rolling his eyes, he produced a Zippo and tossed it as well. But I caught it this time. I flipped the top and struck it, puffing on my first ever cigarette, getting it lit before closing the lid and tossing the lighter back to him. I took a mouthful of smoke and blew it into the air. I looked at the cigarette and back to Billy. Camel. I haven't had one of these before." I shrugged. "It's good." Billy narrowed his eyes and moved away from me. He knew I was full of shit. Knew that I didn't smoke. He knew that I didn't belong here. The only thing he wasn't sure of yet was why. Why was I here? What did I want? He walked over and stood over a rusted oil drum, the kind you see in movies being used as a fireplace by homeless people. He kicked it a couple times. It made a deep ringing sound that echoed loudly off the concrete that surrounded us. He still stared at me and said nothing. His silence was suddenly terrifying. I started to say something, thought better of it, then remembered the cigarette in my hand and brought it up for another puff.
That's not how you do it, dweeb,
he said.
You pull it into your mouth, then you inhale it like this.
He took a drag, inhaled, then let it out in a slow exhale.
What's a kid your age doing smoking anyway? What are you, 12?
I hesitated before answering. 13, actually. I mean, almost. In a few weeks I'll be 13. The cigarette burned between my fingers, and I tried again, following Billy's instructions. My biggest fear was that I would start coughing. I didn't. What happened was I was immediately dizzy. I felt nauseated. Something was wrong. I looked up at Billy through teary eyes, and he laughed.
Jesus, kid. You're pretty fucking stupid.
The nausea soon passed, but was replaced by a keening headache. I had no idea why. My only guess was that I had somehow smoked the cigarette incorrectly. Too fast or too much at once. Either way, I was pretty miserable now. The feeling was made worse by the laughing bully I'd come down here to impress. I tossed the cigarette away and turned to leave. This whole thing had been a mistake. People like this, places like this, they were all out of my league. Girls like Amy Martin were just as unattainable. I would just have to accept that. I took a few steps back toward the road when something crashed into me from behind. My knees buckled, and I went down on my face and stomach on the concrete.
Where are you going, kiddo?
Billy laughed as he pulled my right arm up behind me and pinned it against my backpack. The pain was so sudden and so immense, I barely had time to register what had happened. Billy was dragging me to my feet by very nearly ripping my arm out of its socket. I screamed as I staggered up and then forward, my arm being used to steer my body. He walked me to the oil drum and then stopped.
You owe me a cigarette, asshole,
he said.
I think there's one in there. Go get it.
And with that, he shoved my head into the drum. He pushed and pulled until I was inverted in the can, my arm now pinned between my backpack and my steel prison. He then lifted my legs, and gravity pulled me to the bottom of the can, where my head and left arm splashed into a nasty slush of rancid water and wet cigarette butts. The odor of this and whatever else was in that liquid immediately made me throw up, and now I was covered in that too. I used my left arm to try to push myself out, but it was no use. I was stuck fast. And even if I wasn't able to do a one-handed inverted push-up, even when I wasn't covered in vomit and shit water. It was completely dark. Whichever way I was situated in the barrel, there was no light. I could not move, and as my body settled, either through relaxing muscles or gravity pulling me, I felt myself getting stuck even tighter than before. I kicked my legs frantically, hoping to throw the can off balance so maybe I could crawl out. No such luck. Then Billy must have kicked the can, because I was assailed with a tremendous noise that rattled my teeth. He kicked it a few more times, and each time was just as bad as the first. Then everything went quiet. The quiet was the worst part. The quiet was where I could begin to think about what had happened to me. All at once, the walls of my prison began to close in on me. Everything that had been black in the darkness went a sudden and stark white. I was going to die. I knew now. Nobody knew where I was. I was stuck in this barrel, my arm losing feeling. Billy could just leave me here, and there was forever and always. Nothing I could do about it. My body slid another half-inch into the barrel, and my neck turned at an odd angle. This was it. My stupid, stupid self. I tried one more time, kicking, pushing, screaming. Every ounce of energy pushed as hard as I could against a captor that could not yield. Breathing was becoming difficult with the way my body pressed on my neck. I tried again to shift a little, just to help myself breathe. But it was no use. I could not move. Then something happened. I wiggled the fingers on my pinned right hand, and when I did, something in my backpack shifted. I had an idea. If I could somehow shift the contents of my bag, it might make enough room for me to slip out of the barrel. I didn't have time to think about it. It was my only hope. I began to probe the pack with the limited range of motion I had. There, right next to my thumb, was a zipper. I worked my fingers until I moved the zipper enough to make a hole. Then I pulled the compartment open. One of the soda cans fell out, landed with a splash next to my head. Using my hand to push on the inside of the compartment, I inhaled and pushed, and the second can fell out as well. I then gripped the handle of my knife and pulled it free of the bag. When I relaxed, I slid further into the can, but my right arm came free, and I was able to throw the barrel off balance and knock it over. I scrambled out of the barrel and onto the sandy concrete under the Boot Creek Bridge. I gasped for air, and then choked. Giant, hacking, choking coughs followed as I rolled over and coughed up a cigarette butt. Then I threw up again, although this time there was nothing left but bile. I sat there a moment, on my knees, trying to focus, trying to see, trying to make sense of anything at all. My ears were still ringing from when the barrel had been kicked. My eyes, nose, and mouth were full of vomit and shit water. I glanced up to see the shape of Billy Logan approaching me. He appeared to be smiling and had a hand out. I needed to run, to escape, to get away. He had done this to me. He hadn't meant for me to escape. He was going to put me back in there, back in the barrel. I scrambled backward as he came toward me. I looked to my left and then to my right, and then I noticed I was holding my knife. I quickly popped the snap and pulled it from its sheath. I then held it in both hands and lunged at Billy Logan and sunk its blade, all 10 inches of stainless china, into his belly. Billy's eyes went wide as I stabbed him. He screamed and staggered backward, taking the knife with him as the blade slipped from my hands. He tried to pull it from his stomach, but the inverted saw teeth on the back side of the blade held it in. A blackish red stain appeared on his Iron Maiden t-shirt, and he fell to his knees. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a blubbering, nonsensical slur and a pained hiss. He then toppled over and rolled down the embankment into the littered ditch that was Boot Creek. He landed on his back, the handle of the knife now laying flat against his stomach. I thought for a second of all the damage that thing must have done as it got knocked side to side and up and down as he tumbled. He kicked a time or two, weakly, in the wet scrabble of trash at the bottom of the ditch, then went still. What had I done? Oh my God, what had just happened? Adrenaline and panic rose, almost as badly as it had been in the bottom of the barrel. Bile rose in my throat, and I threw up for the third time that afternoon. What now? Should I call the police? Should I just run away? I should get help. That's what I should do. But what help? I was no doctor, but I imagined a 10-inch blade making random cuts inside the body cavity of a person. There was no help for Billy Logan. The kid was dead. If not now, then definitely by the time I could find someone and bring them back. I should just run. Go out to the train yards and hop on the first one going anywhere. I would just live as a man on the run, telling stories to younger men about the dangers of bridges and trolls. I shook off the thought.
What are you, 12?
Billy's voice in my head. I was just 12, and I had just stabbed a guy to death. What kind of prison do they send a 12-year-old murderer to? Certainly not juvie, the place they send shoplifters and vandals. No, my prison, the one for murderers, it had to be, much worse. It was full of kids just like Billy Logan, except no. Logan might have been a dick, but he was no killer. So it was full of kids that were even meaner than Billy Logan. I shuddered. I could not go to prison. Not for this. This was an accident. This was self-defense. This was retaliation. Anyone could see my clothes and know that he had it coming. I was a good kid with good grades. My father was a decorated war veteran. Billy Logan was a piece of shit criminal who once tried to set the school on fire. If anything, I had done everyone, including myself, a favor. I looked back at the now still body with the giant knife poking out of it, and I knew that I was kidding myself. All the judge would have to ask was why I had that knife with me, and why I had chosen to go under the bridge in the first place. Billy Logan had terrorized me in some way, and I had gone down there seeking revenge. He had fought me, but in the end, the one with the huge knife used it to murder the harmless prankster. The gavel would come down and I would be escorted out in chains to spend the rest of my life among dangerous and violent criminals. I had to cover this up, had to conceal it. I had to get rid of the body. Thunder pealed off in the distance to herald a coming storm. I stared at the body for a long time, daring myself to move. I knew that when I began to move, whatever I did, and whatever the results were, they were permanent. I was dealing with forever here, and as the storm got closer, I knew my time was running out. How was I going to get rid of him? I looked around for an answer. Then I found it. The barrel. I would shove him in and close the top somehow. When Boot Creek came up with the runoff from the storm, Billy, barrel and all, would be washed out into the bay. Flushed away. Gone, gone, gone. I could think of no other solution, so I got to work. I took off my backpack and stashed it high on the bank, then rolled the barrel down into the ditch. The echoing noise it made as it bounced off the concrete was deafening, and I was sure that someone was going to hear and investigate. I couldn't worry about that. I ran down and pulled the knife from Billy's belly. The saw teeth held chunks of flesh and gore that I'd have to scrub to get off. But for now, I needed to hide the knife as well. Then if anyone came along, I could say I found him like this. I was just trying to get him out, rather than into the barrel. I rolled the open end to his head, and then lifted his head and shoulders into the can. He was heavier than I thought he'd be, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to get the job done. I was also creeped out by his half-lidded eyes. I half expected him to jump up and grab me like a killer in a monster movie. I hoped he would even. But I knew he would not. He was dead, and I had to get him into this barrel. I worked the barrel from side to side and inched the body into it little by little. Once I got a little past his hips, his head hit the bottom of the can, and I couldn't get the rest of him in. I sat there for a second thinking. When I'd been upside down in the barrel, my neck had turned. And when it did, my body had shifted and more of me had fallen in. I needed to use gravity to help. I went to the open end of the barrel and tried lifting it, but it was too heavy. Then I bent Billy's knees and tried to shove them in. One of them caught on the side of the can, and it made it easier for me to get a grip. I held on to the side of that barrel and pushed with all my strength. Harder and harder than I had ever tried to do anything before, and little by little, the barrel righted itself, and the body of Billy Logan slipped further inside. Once I was done folding the other leg and pushing the corpse in, the barrel was only about 3/4 full. I thought about how to close the top. The rain was closer now. I could smell it in the air along with the sludge and cigarettes from the barrel. The creek was flowing a bit more than it had been as well. I needed to hurry. How would I close this thing? There was no lid. Then I saw one of the Dr. Pepper cans that had fallen from my backpack. It had fallen out and rolled down here with us, and the top had been crushed somehow in all the confusion. I had a flash of inspiration and cast about looking for as big a rock as I could find. I found what I needed and set to work collapsing the top of the barrel on 2 sides. I then hammered the sides in, basically sealing the top by crushing the top in on him. If I was lucky, the barrel would float away, maybe as far as the bay. And by the time they found the body, there would be nothing left to connect me to it in any way. As the rain began to fall around Boot Creek Bridge, I left the barrel and the worst mistake I'd ever made behind. I collected my backpack and my knife. I wondered about the spots of blood that glistened here and there on the concrete, but as the water began to flow down the sides of the culvert, I was comfortable that it would wash away. And even if it didn't, it would blend with the swastikas and other graffiti down there. God is dead, indeed. I walked home in the rain, very slowly. I needed the water to wash me clean. I stopped behind the car wash and rinsed the blood and chunks off the knife. I would take a toothbrush to it later, but this would do for now. I cried as I worked. For the first time since Billy had attacked me, I'd been able to actually think about what had happened. A series of full-bodied shudders shook me, and I cried from my core. I cried for myself and what was going to happen when they found me. I imagined the looks on my parents' faces, my grandparents. I cried for my teachers and my friends, and everyone I'd let down by doing this stupid stunt. Strangely enough, though, I didn't cry for Billy Logan. I could still feel the wet, nasty cigarette butt lodged in my throat. No, although I cried for many, many things on that walk home, Billy Logan got none of my tears. When I got home, Dad was still at work, and Mom's car was gone, meaning she was out running errands. And that meant I had time. I was completely drenched and fully exhausted, and the entire contents of my backpack were thoroughly soaked. I took out the knife and shoved it into my pants before dropping the bag in the laundry room and going to my room. I set the knife in its spot on my closet shelf and peeled my clothes off. running to dump them into the washing machine. Then I got into the shower and scrubbed my entire body, over and over again, with the hottest water I could stand. When I was done, I brushed my teeth longer and harder than I ever had before, or since. Then I started over again. In the days that come, every phrase that anyone uttered scared me. I assumed that any second someone would call my name, and there would be a cop waiting to take me in. I was a murderer, after all. In English class, we'd been studying Poe's story, The Telltale Heart. Of course we were. I sat quietly as that heart beat in that crawl space, and that killer gave himself up to the cops. I felt like I was being tested, like they knew it was me and were giving me a chance to give myself up. I started to wonder if cops got bigger paychecks if the criminals confessed, because they didn't have to pay the lawyers as much. Well, I was going to make them work for it. I wasn't going to say a word until I had no other choice. Even if they put me in chains and took me away, I'd never tell anyone what I'd done. I tried to convince myself it had just been a horrible dream anyway, and that Billy Logan would come bursting through that door any minute, middle fingers blazing. I knew he wouldn't, of course, but I hoped. It was a full 5 days before anyone reported Billy missing. Apparently his attendance at home had been just as sporadic as at school. Nobody even realized he was gone for almost a week. When the first missing person sign showed up on the bulletin board in the cafeteria, I just about fainted. People talked, of course. There were rumors. I listened to whoever was talking about what they'd heard. Billy had run away. He had a drug problem and owed a dealer. He moved to California to start a band. He got kidnapped by Satanists. He moved to California with a bunch of Satanists to start a band. I relaxed a little as each one of these stories came out. At least none of them claimed to have seen Billy getting his guts pulverized by a 12-year-old dork under Boot Creek Bridge. Days turned to weeks, and weeks to months. The local police had never liked that kid, and were probably just happy he had moved on. Everyone pretty much agreed that he had just run away from home. His mom showed up at city council meetings and swore that if he'd just run away, he would have at least called her by now. But she was a mean drunk who had punched a cop in front of the Dixie Mart on Christmas Eve, so they didn't like her either. The missing person signs faded, and with them, the memory of Billy Logan. I turned 13 without having been caught. Then 14. My folks moved from Westport to Dallas, then from Dallas to Tallahassee. I graduated high school, then college, and went on to have a family and a career in a city and state I'd rather not mention. In the end, nobody put much effort into finding Billy Logan. Not much effort at all. I suppose that when all was said and done, he wasn't someone I needed to be friends with. After all.
The throat is deep and the mouth is wide. These are the first words spoken to me by Dr. Laurence Archer, whom I found in a rather poor state when I came to visit him at his home in Massachusetts. I'd expected to arrive and be greeted in a jovial manner, as I'd been accustomed to on my many frequent visits to his home. I often brought my wife with me, but he's a lifelong bachelor, had only his dog Rafferty as company. This didn't mean our visits were by any means dull, as he was capable of holding our attention long into the night. But to begin here is to understate the importance of his place in my life, and to know less of the story than one should. I'd been a medical student when I had met Laurence, long before the title of doctor had been placed upon him, and we both studied greatly at Harvard before we parted ways, I on a career in the psychoses, and he into biological medicine. He was more successful than I, as I found myself unable to cope with the pressures of my chosen field, and retreated instead into the world of business. Still, we had no opportunity to see each other, but we kept correspondence, and thus we kept each other apprised of our ways in life. It was many years before he announced to me that he was leaving his medical practice out east and returning to his home city to work as a private physician for an elderly gentleman of great wealth. I worked this out to be Pembroke Armbruster, who lived in a gated manor not far from where I lived, and I soon learned that Laurence would take up his own residence within walking distance of our home. It was a great joy when he first invited us to his new home, a sprawling Gothic edifice of great splendor, and though we had both aged noticeably in the time I had last seen him in person, he was still the same jovial, smiling fellow I remembered him to be, full of life and ideas. He absolutely adored my wife, and she him. At first, I'll admit my concern that she eyed him in a way that was not unlike the way she once looked at me during our courtship, but Laurence would reassure me privately in later evenings that science was his first and only love, and that he remained uninterested in a relationship with another. Rafferty, a mutt who Laurence believed was a cocker-spaniel border terrier mix of some sort, was all he said he needed, mainly to wake him in the event of a burglary. I informed him burglaries were not common here, but regardless, the dog was a lovable scoundrel, even if not the most well-mannered creature. He'd often approach the table and steal a piece of bread or meat if he wasn't watched carefully, but what brings me to the day I found him began with a conversation he and I had during a dinner. My wife had unfortunately been taken ill with dropsy and was on bed rest with medicine from our personal physician, and didn't attend this particular visit. Having a glass of wine with some splendidly cooked lamb and asparagus, Laurence swirled his drink and asked me, "Herbert, in order to speak with you on an important matter, I must go against my own code as a physician and break the confidentiality between doctor and patient. Would you go to your grave, not telling a soul about what I'm to tell you?" Now, for those of you of whom I relate this story, please understand at the time I agreed to his request. However, based on the events I'm about to tell you, know that I only divulged them to you due to the highly unusual and frightening items that are to come, and that only God may forgive me for not keeping my word. He placed down his drink, folded his hands, and breathed deeply. "I very nearly lost my patient today, Herbert. His heart arrested, and it took all of my skill as a doctor to bring him back. Well then, my friend, what's the problem? You do yourself a disservice. Truly, he is graced that you're there to watch him." He pounded on the table. "But it was the time, Herbert, the time. He'd been gone for nearly 20 minutes. 20 damn minutes. No breath, no pulse, and yet he sits in his bed and tells me he meant for it to happen." I blinked, stunned. His employer meant to kill himself. He's suicidal? But what are you doing here? Should you not be? "I have asked the police to remain with him. The the remainder of the night. They're under the belief that he is to be kept under watch for a potential second arrest, and to contact me if it should happen. I didn't tell them what he planned, partly for his own ego, and partly because of what he told me. He stood and moved to the window. You recall, Herbert, in our studies together, the phenomenon of those who say they see a white light and then return to their bodies. I did indeed, and told him so. As I said, I left the field of medicine, but this notion of a vision of the world to come after was regarded as a curiosity amongst our professors and colleagues. Some truly believed it was that of angels and loved ones leading them on to the path of heaven. It was a notion I remained agnostic about, but I did not doubt the sincerity of those who saw. And in this, I knew, Laurence and I differed. He believed, as many who taught us did, that what these visions were was nothing more than the fancy of a dying brain, a last hurrah before descending into that endless night of death. Laurence wasn't a man who thought life continued in such a way, and it was rare that I did not see him vocal on the subject, though, as friends, he often gave me some leeway. Pembroke told me that in those 20 minutes he lay on the floor, he had seen a vision, but it was not of white light nor of angelic beings. No, he saw something of a much darker tone. He regaled me with Pembroke's prophecy of a dark hole with walls like the inside of a vein pulsing and red, of crackling and catcalls down deep inside of a void, of beckoning shadows. It was all so horrifying to hear, of a dying man seeing a fate beyond his worst imaginings. When Pembroke had finished, he asked for someone to whom he could confess, and a place where he could donate much of his wealth. He followed by saying, "They made me promise not to tell, but you know me, I can't help myself." At that, Laurence chuckled. "You know my position, old friend, as many do. You know, any priest in town would hang up the phone if I called. I simply gave him a gentle sedative so that he could rest before I contacted the authorities. But you see how I'm conflicted, Herbert. All these cases of bright lights, happiness, warmth, but in all this time, not one that is documented of a place far, far worse. A different vision could mean, in fact, that the mind is traveling outside of the body to another place. If he has stood at the gates of hell, then surely there might truly be something to investigate in all this." I'd never seen him so animated, so willing to cast aside his doubts. But then, of course, there was no need to believe he'd changed his views, as he soon told me. If he indeed speaks true, then it can be replicated. There is a way to see this and bring back knowledge from the point of death. I don't yet know the method, but rest assured, I'll determine once and for all this place, be it madness, the heavens or hells, or another world, is something that science can see and even better explain. Does that not intrigue you as well, to pull the reality from the words of fantasy? I must admit, it did. But not to the degree he was now infatuated. I knew we all must face death at some point, but I hoped my visit was far distant, following a long and productive life. I had no desire to hasten it. We talked about this subject for a short time after, but Laurence seemed to notice my hesitation in wanting to discuss it further. We ended the evening talking of more pleasant things. It would not be long before he once again mentioned this new obsession in our letters, and at one point I did have to remind him that not long ago he believed such a thing was nonsense. "I do not believe it," he responded in his letters, "but I have to see it. If there's a way to do so, I will." Time went by, and I didn't hear from my friend. The summer months fell into autumn, and a definitive chill filled the air, along with a dampness that again made my wife fall ill. I stayed at her side, but there was little that could be done by my hand. The doctor stated that perhaps I would be best occupied in other pursuits, as she had her rest. Not quite knowing what to do with myself, it struck me that perhaps I should visit my friend and do so unexpectedly. I had still not heard from him, and thought perhaps he could use some company. If he was suffering from some melancholy, a possibility, for he might have had a setback in his research, my face at his door might be just what he needed. I arrived at his doorstep and knocked, but received no answer. However, his door was unlocked, and that was unusual. I heard Rafferty barking inside, as well as scampering on the hard floor. Spurred on by the dog's franticness, I pushed my way in to find him running towards me, leading me to his master, who had fallen to the floor, the door to his study open, not far distant. I rolled him onto his back to find him pale, his breathing weak, but his eyes wide. He was cold with sweat. Whatever shock he had sustained, I need to act quickly to recover his wits. And that was when he spoke those words to me. He did in fact recover, looking warmer and more himself within an hour, once I had provided blankets and a pillow to which to prop him up. But he spoke little more than asking for drink and thanking me for the aid I provided. After some more time had passed, he became slightly more communicative and bade me help him to his bed. I did so, but on our way I finally was able to take a look into his study. Due in part to my desire to help him, I'd not glanced in there at all during my time there. My search for blankets and pillows led me to the sitting room, which was on the opposite end of the hall. But there I saw some sort of contraption, shaped rather like an electric chair. I would have said exactly like one, but for some sort of monitoring device attached to it by wires. Once I'd gotten him settled and his color returned to full, he motioned for me to sit near him. "Herbert, I've done it." There was triumph in his voice, but at the same time there was something else. Fear? Disappointment? "You've seen the place Pembroke described? You've been there?" "Yes." "You saw my device, I take it. The chair in my study. Tell me, what time, what day is it?" A little confused, I told him the time. At this he grew slightly pale once more. I asked him his reasoning, but he shook his head. "In a moment. But first, what are you doing here, my friend?" I explained to him his lack of letters and how I felt a visit would be the best thing for his spirits and mine. He smiled and nodded. "Indeed, in recent times I've not been as good a friend as I would like. But you must understand, once I'd stumbled upon the very nature of my machine, I could not but help giving it my all. I do apologize, and hope in the future to send you word. But I'm glad you happened along when you did. Even now my senses do not feel as if they've fully recovered." Even so, he regaled me with his tale. "My machine is a finely tuned instrument, capable of sending the user a brief electrical current designed to immobilize the senses, slow the body, and drive it to just the edge of death itself. It took some time to get it right, but on my last effort I saw. First, it was that realm of white light, of beckoning hands, of voices from my past. They urged me, prudence, to either come with them or return to earth. At that I shouted, wishing to see the realm of darkness, to know full well that if they were truly heaven, then they should have the power to show me hell as well. Herbert paused in his recollection. That they did. He paused once more to take a small sip from his drink. They tried to tell me, but I could not stop myself. I was at the mouth of the darkness. I saw the red-lined walls, just like the throat of a large animal, pulsing, diseased, swimming with shapes just below the surface of the taut skin. The yawning darkness beyond, with its wailing and cacophony, stood ahead, bending down into an infinite abyss. And then, beyond the calls, something came crawling up from the darkness and took hold of me. He shook. I saw some things on the other side, Herbert. Things no one should see, even those who live lives of utter cruelty and depravity. They did things to me, or whatever part of me traveled there. Tortured, imprisoned, experimented on at one point. They put something inside of me, laughing all the way. He swallowed and pulled the covers further over himself. I asked you the date, Herbert, because, while it appears less than an hour passed here, I was aware of their work for days, weeks. At one point, I believed it had been the better part of a year. Whatever that realm is, time flows differently there, and they are relentless in their pursuits. He took hold of my hand, launching it quickly out from under the sheets, grabbing it with an icy grip. Do not use that machine, Herbert. Under no circumstances should you seek the knowledge that I have had. Only I should know more. There are consequences for what I've done, surely. I'll report to you more once I have. No, Laurence. You've suffered enough as it is. I cannot bear to see you in this state once again. Stay away from that machine, at least until you're much recovered. He took me and nodded. The key to my study is in my bedside table. Please take it with you once you've locked the door. And thank you for your concern, but I do tell you, I'm afraid this may have just begun. I did as he asked, and assured that he would suffer no more that evening, I returned home to my wife. Life became uneventful for another week. Laurence responded twice to me in letters, both to reassure me that he was well and remaining away from the machine. Then nothing once more. I grew concerned and believed that I should once more go to visit, until I received a note exactly 7 days after I had last visited him. Herbert, my dear friend, it is with good news that I inform you that you should come by immediately. My recovery is being speedy, and I wish for us to have dinner once more. I believe it is in our interest to destroy the machine, and I'll require you to bring the key so we can do the work together. Please hurry, for I wish for it to trouble me no more. Laurence. Encouraged by this new letter, I went to his home straight away and knocked upon the door. From within, I heard him call. Herbert, is that you? Yes, my friend. I just received your letter. Excellent. Please come in and make yourself welcome. I have a few things to attend to in my bedroom. If you would please go to the sitting room, I shall meet you there shortly. I heard his footsteps retreat and let myself into the house. I went to the sitting room and settled in. The fall was coming on quickly, and the room had developed a bit of a chill. I would have thought Laurence would have started a fire himself, but considering his spirits, perhaps he simply hadn't noticed. I bent down to begin work at the fireplace, and had started a fine fire with it, when I found the paper. It had been crumpled and browned at the edges, but had been flung into the fireplace with such force that it had survived the last fire that had been placed there. I used the poker to retrieve it, as throwing what was clearly manuscript paper in the fire was not something Laurence did out of habit. I uncurled the paper. It was in Laurence's unmistakable script. Herbert. I'd written a letter earlier, but it appears to have never reached you. In it I said goodbye. Believe me, I had to try. I've not been well the last few days. The world is a different place to me. Everything is reminding me that I am not who I used to be. Presence has entered my life. I believe I was alone when I returned to our world, but I came back haunted. Sometimes I find myself, unaware of how I got there, standing in front of my study door. More and more it feels as if something inside me wants me to disappear, to use me for nefarious purposes. One of these days, I don't think I'll be coming back. Herbert, when you get this letter, please know this may be the last time I speak to you as a friend. And as a friend, please ignore any requests to come and visit me. Knowing what I know, I would not do such a thing to you. Please, for the love of God or whoever runs this universe, that whatever would invite you back to this house is no longer me. Here the letter trailed off into unintelligible scrawling and strange symbols. There was also something brown, something not the work of a fire, dotting its surface. Madness, I thought. He's descended into madness. He's experiencing a mania of some sort and needs medication to handle it. He was still in his bedroom as far as I knew. I ran for it, hoping he was still in a mood amenable to seeking a doctor's touch. I opened the bedroom door, and to this day I wish I had not. I had been in such a state that I had not considered that Rafferty had not come to greet me upon my entrance. I now know why, as his poor body had been rendered into such a state that to describe what had been done with it would be unsympathetic to whoever hears these words. Know simply that what remains of the corpse had been placed in an ungodly ritual manner around the room, with candles placed on some of the parts to make some sort of star symbol, connected by chalk. I can only hope now that the soul of that poor creature has gone to where all good dogs go. As for the other inhabitant, I can only agree with the letter that whatever wore the body of Laurence Archer, it was no longer my friend. It turned to face me as I approached the door. The eyes had been ripped from their sockets, but instead of empty holes, there were dark orbs, with a white dot that flickered and flamed in their middle. His mouth had been torn to reveal his red, raw jaws and teeth, although some had become longer, sharper, much like the claws that now capped his fingers. His clothes ill-fit, like the creature was fighting to burst through them. It pointed to its handiwork, and if its red mouth still contained lips, it would have smiled, I'm sure. "Herbert, I've got something for you to see." To hear Lawrence's perfectly normal voice emerge from that creature, saying my name, was almost worse than the carnage before me. I shut the door as the monstrosity threw itself against the wood, pounding and trying to turn the doorknob. I knew my efforts to contain the beast would be fruitless before too long, as the door opened inwards, and I had no key to lock it from this side. A key! I reached into my pocket and felt the key there. What did it want with that machine, which lay locked within the study? I began to feel that whatever malevolent purpose this thing had, it would never have the chance to use it. The banging on the door became more frantic, and the thing called out to me, pleading, still speaking in Lawrence's voice. "Please, Herbert, I'm well now. We must go to my study together." I reached next to me for an end table, which was of fairly sturdy construction, and wedged it under the door handle. The knob was now having difficulty turning, but I knew I would not have much time before it escaped, and would have me with it. I smelled a faint wisp of smoke. In its haste, the creature must have knocked over a candle in the room. With that, I had the inspiration for what I must do. Returning down to the sitting room, I lit the letter in the fireplace, wrapped it around the poker, and began lighting the curtains in the room. The fabric went quickly. I went to several other rooms, lighting what I could before the paper gave out, so that the house would have no chance but to remain alight. I escaped out the front door just as I heard the sound of splintering wood from within. I ran down the front steps and called for the fire brigade, knowing all too well that the house would be unsalvageable by the time they arrived. One passerby heard my calls and went to find them. I looked back up at the edifice, crushed with the memories with my friend that I had within those walls, to be only memories forevermore. At a window, I saw a shape pounding on the glass before the flames engulfed the room, and it was gone. The police asked questions, but I answered them all very convincingly, mainly because the truth can be very subjective. He was my good, true friend, and the fire started purely by accident. I tried to rescue him, which was true before I knew the truth, but by the time I was able to do so, it was too late. There was no reason to question my reputation, as I was a respected doctor. No other questions were raised, and to this day, I carry that knowledge with me. But understand me, that the most important thing has happened. The chair, and the ability to see into worlds beyond our own, was destroyed that day, and the creature that had taken my dear Laurence with it. At least that is my hope. I still do wonder about what journey he had been on. There's a morbid curiosity to see it myself, but thankfully, with the company of my wife, those remain simple flights of fancy. Still, it is with trepidation that I wonder if, when I someday leave this earth, it will be with joy or via a dark throat beckoning me forward.
That which is done out of love always takes place beyond good and evil. Friedrich Nietzsche. These weren't like the old days, Gerfastelak mused. No. In this black age, nothing like that peace could be found. They had pain birds now, killing birds. Great, screaming, swooping demons that raked the sky and shat fire, rattled the bones brittling across the cave's floor. These death birds were not all they had. One bright morning, while gathering food for he and his lover, Moazareth, Gerfastelak had idled a few moments, sprawled among yellow bursts of primrose. A cool flower breeze washed over the hill. Suddenly, the sky caught fire. A second sun rose and blossomed into a blazing mushroom. The earth shuddered, then rumbled as if about to open and swallow its children. The flash blinded Gerfastelak. Wild terror surged through him. When sight and stability returned, he saw a horror. Below the hill on which he stood, far away from the yellow flowers, the colony of the Ugly Ones burned. From this vantage point, Gerfastelak was spared nothing. Could see the colony lay flat, twisted, and unrecognizable save for one tall structure near the river. Scattered fires raged, cries of the maimed, the dying, could be heard borne upon the burning wind. At that moment, two wishes choked Gerfastelak's heart. I wish these visions, these sounds did not exist, and I wish to forget them. Moazareth, upon hearing the tale of annihilation from her lover, sank into sorrow. Nothing Gerfastelak did could lift from her this dark veil. The crushing of rodents went unnoticed. 7 carapace-cracking dives from the tallest cliff barely took her attention off the lazy arc of a falling leaf. Levitating Moazareth into the air merely lulled her into fitful slumber. She hardly paid his antics any attention, not even when Gerfastelak raised a pincer, punched into his abdomen, and drizzled the molten gold that pulsed inside over a scuttling hermit crab. So profound was Moazareth's anguish she refused even to wear the gilded gift around her neck, despite the considerable difficulty Gerfastelak endured trapping the squid, hostile and slippery, whose entrails he braided into a string for the plated crab. Was there no way to cheer her? Had Fastalack's news of the devastation been solely responsible for his lover's distress? Leaving Moazareth cloaked in sorrow, he went searching for some remedy that might restore her. Sad and alone, Ushiro Funakashi climbed the steep trail that cut through the land above his secluded cottage in Kamuriyama. Ushiro had fled the bleak horrors of war and spent each morning running toward the sky in green silence, exhaling the stink of his past. In these hills, along this twisting secret path, he hoped to sweeten the bitterness poisoning his heart, fill the void in his days once occupied by his father. Tadashi Funakoshi, strong as the bamboo and pine around the family home, had given himself to the rising sun as a pilot in the suicide force known as the Divine Wind. He died the noble kamikaze death. What was noble about it? Kamikaze. Divine Wind indeed. Father was dead. Ushiro's photographs of him possessed in their abandonment a weird dignity, at once iconic and mocking, unbearable. The Americans and their atomic bombs had drained the spirit from Japan. No divine wind ever imagined could have extinguished those infernos. Ushiro rounded a weedy bend, sensed something deep in the forest pacing him. He stopped, heart hammering his ribs. He listened. From the undergrowth leapt a pair of chirping crickets. "Oh!" Ushiro cried and laughed. They hopped across the path, flitted into dense ferns. He stepped into the dark woods. Here, among fern and flower, was a small pool. The waters emanated a fragrance of drowned lilies, and Ushiro counted 9 at the bottom, white stars set in green. A praying mantis clicked across his sandals, but Ushiro stood still as the pool. The exotic insect had as much right to live as he, perhaps more. At least you, stick-legs, take life only when you hunger, or in self-defense. As if reading his mind, the mantis deftly snatched a cricket from the pool's edge and, with a crack, pinched off its head. Ushiro shuddered, beheld his pale reflection in the pool. Rain began to fall, spatting ceaseless circles. The young man's image shivered and blurred. A downpour ensued. Leaves wept. Behind Ushiro, a twig snapped. He pulled his gaze from the pool. Great Bushi. Whether what towered above him was dragon, hummingbird, or beetle, Ushiro could not decide. The sight of it stopped his breath and sense. This must be Furyu, a reminder of the imperfection in perfection. Or, something whispered in Ushiro's heart, was it just the opposite? Bending at one scarlet joint, the Furyu bowed its gold-green head and with some effort drank the pool. Delicately it raised itself, steam sighed from lemon mandibles, and it was not without awe that Ushiro beheld those unblinking eyes of emerald, glittering in the rain like 2 fantastic jewels. The Furyu gazed down in judgment, fixed the man in place with those mesmerizing discs. Ushiro's terror abated. Tranquility bloomed. With this came a flood of images. Father leaving for war. Mother not weeping until that night, alone in the bedroom. Lightning at dawn. A violent fork stabbing the sea. Doves scattering from the eaves of a dead temple. The drunken painter in Kyoto splashing snow, cherry, cobalt, orange, lime. Ushiro seated in the overheated schoolroom, his shoes too tight. Ushiro's last thought, before this perfection ended him, howled like a winter tempest. Great Bushi, 1,000-year-old samurai, I go with you to join my father. Fastalack wandered the solemn pines for days. Light and dark went unnoticed beneath his attention. Soon, thirst would kill him, but his olfactory lobes detected water. Thirst, though, was a minor concern compared to his pulsing dread. What if no way could be found to deliver Moazarith from her misery? Should she perish, there would follow nothing but blackness and solitude, for where did others of her kind exist? Jerfastelak concluded that life without his lover would be unbearable. If she died, he would engineer his own demise rather than live in desolation, sentenced for eternity to the prison of loneliness. There, straight ahead to the water, something approached. Plip-plop, plip-plop, plip-plop. From the sound, a sizable creature, fleeing some beast larger still, dashing toward water. Ahead, shards of sunlight cut through trees. A clearing. Jerfastelak quickened his step, careful not to cause a stir. Fat raindrops began falling. In seconds, dark clouds dumped water in torrents, pummeled the ferns. Green saplings nodded as though confirming Jerfastelak's plight, but the rain could not mask the ever-rising scent. Their scent. This was not strong. Probably just one of them. Hardly a threat. Never had Jerfastelak stood near an ugly one, so curiosity ruled his behavior as much as thirst. He broke through the undergrowth. Here was a quiet pool. The ugly one glanced up, its face pale and moist. How tiny are you? Jerfastelak thought. The other appeared impossibly soft and fragile, face revealing every nuance of emotion. Could such a being actually slaughter its own kind? Jerfastelak drew closer. Fright quivered the flesh of the ugly one who, after all, really was not so ugly. It fears me. I must not cause fear. Must not trouble this one. What if the tiny creature led others to the pool? Jerfastelak ended this possibility by bending nearly in two and drinking the pool. Ah, life, relief, soothing cold. The ugly one stood solemn. Jerfastelak stretched across the empty pool. I shall console you. He grasped the creature by its neck. No, no, do not struggle. Do not fear, shrilled Jerfastelak, unaware that his voice, to the limited hearing of the other, shrieked unintelligibly. Jerfastelak's hold weakened, and in his haste to regain it, clenched his pincher, severing the head of the ugly one, when he had meant only comfort. The head spun through rainy air, spewing blood and smashing against a rock, cracking open and flinging bits of gray, white, and red across the ground. Oh, what have I done? Warm shards oozed over Jerfastelak's clawed feet. I have ended it. Then he saw tiny white bones scattered through the moss. Fascinated, he dropped the leaking corpse into the weeds, stooped, and plucked several bones from the springy moss. Beauty. There is beauty and perfection in these. One bone, incredible, bore a gold plug or seal. How had this creature procured blood from one such as Jerfastelak? What secrets might have we shared had I not ended you? Into his mouth went the bones, mandibles clacked shut. Powerful digestive acids flooded the orifice, dissolving the ugly one's teeth, gold mingling with that of Jerfastelak's circulatory system. After a few moments, there came a strange elation. Energy, unlike any before, thrummed through his limbs. The white bones must possess curative effects. Perhaps these should be fed to Moazarith. Hope. Hope. Sudden pain spiked his thorax. With a pincher, he punctured his shell, probed, and located the irritant. Wrenching it free revealed a malleable white mass larger far than the original bones ingested. Some strange alchemy must have occurred between them and their taker's digestives, but Jerfastelak would not be intimidated. Curious, he played with and molded the warm blob. This conjured a memory. Once, while cooling off in a rushing river, he had scooped clay from the weedy bed. Moazarith had taken this and, with skilled, sensitive pincers and mind sight, sculpted it into a likeness of her lover. Could this material be likewise formed? Already it grew firm. He must hurry. Bracing the mass with a pincher, he took the other and squeezed, scraped, stippled, and pulled. Mind sight added further detail. An inspired burst of activity created the figure of a hopping croaker, an albino with eyes golden and bulging. This must be good. Must be. The headless body of Ushiro Funakoshi lay undiscovered for months until one autumn night, when the crickets creaked and the moon daubed his bones with its luminous brush. A spider crept onto them, spun a chaotic web between two ribs and, where once pulsed a young man's heart, assumed its silent sentinel, glittering in moonglow like a jet crystal. If Ushiro's starving ghost haunted the place of his death, it did not disturb one thread of the spider's net. Gerfastelak saw his lover lay dying and shrilled her name. Every bird, beast, and insect fled that unearthly howl. He stood over her, offered the white figure. "Eat this, Moazarith. You must." Weakly, she opened her mandibles, eyes brightening but for a moment as she recognized what the object represented. Her lover fed her the albino croaker. With an effort, Moazarith broke down the hard enamel. She shuddered, vibrated her thorax. "What charms does this conceal?" Gerfastelak leaned close. "I do not know, but it filled me with the breath of youth." Gazing into the twin gems of her eyes, he could see fiery life. Would she live? Thrive as before? Moazarith, after absorbing the figure, produced no precipitate. Her lover reasoned that his own caustics must have greatly weakened whatever catalyst activated the process. What else could account for this? 2 sunfalls passed during which Moazarith shone floridly in good health. On the third, as twilight spilled deep blue into the cave, her robust demeanor dwindled, then wholly failed. Alerted by her hollow tone, Gerfastelak knew something was terribly wrong. "The white croaker," she managed. "Bring me more. Bring me many." Creeping shadows settled over her like a shroud of doom. Embracing her, Gerfastelak again tasted the dread of solitude. Moazarith, of course, did not know where the albino croaker originated, nor what her lover had done to obtain its ingredients. Gerfastelak, as strongly as he loathed to repeat the act, feared more losing his beloved to the black waters of the river of death. "Lover," she pleaded. "Hurry." Her golden tongue traced Gerfastelak's plated throat. Easing her onto the cool cave floor, he determined to hunt day and night, gather so copious a cache of bones he need never leave Moazarith's beauty again. Any pain, any horror was preferable to a life barren and loveless. He must hurry, go out into the world and collect what must be collected. Any living thing that dare stand in his path would know the face of death. Here rose a hill, a view, a special place. The bleak hunter surveyed the province of the dead. Would not there be a nearly limitless supply of the tiny bones here, free to harvest? Gerfastelak ascertained he was not being watched and climbed down from his perch. Beneath purple twilight, the burial ground stood stark and silent. Trees twisted and black clawed at the moon's silver scythe. At the heart of this necropolis, a tall light post ticked with moths. Honey-sweet whiffs of paraffin and incense lingered in the air, phantoms of some recent ritual. The hunter moved among ranked stone monuments, some taller than he. Any grave would suffice. There came a sensation as nameless as it was novel. Ushiro Funakoshi, were he alive and not suffocating in the endless night of transmigration, might have called this awe. The hunter had never seen another of his kind in death. All he knew of his and Moazarith's existence was that both were immensely old. Of their origins he knew nothing. He paused before a bulky gray monument which bore the chiseled likeness of an ugly one, slanted eyes, long mournful expression, as though the face might slide from the stone like shadow crossing water. Below this, rows of sharp etchings like marching insects. From this grave, the hunter absorbed an aura of violence, hatred, and betrayal. Did this originate with its attendants, or the occupant? At once there bloomed a vision, a solitary figure, perched on the edge of a chasm boiling with crimson mist. Above this, the sun towed a flaming raft of clouds. The figure cried out, jumped into the abyss. Whoever lay below in black silence was not mourned. Gerfastelak bowed to the earth, extended his pincers, spread the lemon blades of his mandibles, and scored the soil. At first its dead solidity resisted, but soon the exhumation was finished. The hunter's pincers scraped against something harder than the musty dark earth. He straightened to his full height of 13 feet and drew huge breaths from the gloom. Finally, braced about the grave's periphery by 4 of his spiky limbs, he reached into the pit and gripped the coffin. Slowly, he raised it toward dying twilight, brasswork gleaming beneath the moon's cold face. Brighter stars jeweled the sky, indifferent suns flaring nothingness. The hunter rested his prize on the ground and, with a violent stroke, smashed its lid into long splinters. Offended by the strong odor, Gerfastelak's olfactory lobes twitched. The corpse's flesh shone pale green, patched here and there with gray rot and shiny with moisture. The hunter lifted the body from its seclusion, eased it onto dewy grass. Death lent the face a composure both stern and tragic, as though this ugly one's sleep stirred still with dreams of ruined empires, of love lost. The hunter touched the flesh. Its taut chill unsettled him, and for the first time, he wondered what life as an ugly one might be like. What terrors, what hopes, what joys. With a delicacy belying his size, the hunter prized apart the corpse's jaws, took the flat sides of both pincers and clamped the skull, squeezing until, with a loud report, it split like a rotten log. Thick, putrid fluid welled up. Unanchored teeth were gathered, others pried from dry sockets. Abruptly, the hunter sampled one. Rage blazed. Useless. These bones were useless. Dead. All traces of life force gone. Waste. My struggle and sorrow futile. Dead. Dead! In his fury, the hunter walloped the gravestone, smashing it into jagged pieces. Headless with despair, he turned from the pit and shambled toward the looming hills. Though unaware, the hunter bled droplets of molten gold from a fissure in his carapace. After a few moments, these cooled in dewy grass. Perhaps on the morrow some mourner, sad and starved, might gather them, follow their trail to the desecrated grave, and wonder, with drumming heart and wide eyes, why some terrible goblin had felt compassion enough to scatter such riches along this path of misery. Dawn. The sun sailed above the horizon like a blob of molten bronze. The sky blushed a marriage of rose and flame. From his concealment, the hunter regarded this vista with anticipatory calm. Only the jewels of his eyes broke the mirrored surface of the pond in which he lay. Now and then dragonflies and rainbow wings lit upon them, hummed and buzzed and clicked, before taking to the air once more. Not far from the pond stood a fence of cross-hatched steel, the top adorned with razored loops of barbed wire. Beyond this stretched black runways, seemingly endless, blurred by heat shimmer. As the hunter watched, a silver skyraker raced toward him, gaining speed with each moment, then nosed sharply into crisp morning air. The thing whined over the pond and headed for sunrise. The hunter rose dripping, locked his emerald gaze and, focusing his mind sight, pulled the aircraft from the sky. With great velocity it plunged earthward, engines screaming their torment. Sunlight flashed across a row of windows. An instant before impact, 52 minds wailed their common doom, piercing the hunter's resolve and nearly undoing him. The ground shuddered with the crash. The aircraft plowed through 1,000 feet of tall grass, shrieking, crumbling, scattering a fiery litter of metal, plastic, and people. Heat wavering from hissing fires did not deter the hunter, for the gold of his very blood burned hotter far. He must hurry, harvest what he came for lest the ugly ones spot him. Quickly, quickly. Hooked by a mangled engine cowling, the armless torso, and the head, of an ugly one smoldered. The rest of him must be lost among the widely strewn wreckage. The hunter loomed over his prey, bent at his scarlet abdomen, and pried open the broken mouth, deftly extracting those bones intact enough for use. These he deposited into his own mouth for storage. Farther along the path of burning debris he found his fortune. Here was a fantastic union of bodies. 2 females, locked in an embrace. Squashed onto them an obese male whose open back revealed layers of yellow fat, shattered bone, and the head of one of the females. Fused by flame into a single entity, the threesome became, in death, more intimate than any fevered fantasy in life. Although he did not care for the stench of this collage, the hunter carried out his duty. Finally, heading back toward the pond, his path lay hindered by a melting seat. Still strapped in, an ugly one burned. Little more than blackened bone, smoking hair and gristle, it screamed at the sight of death's angel. Shock surged through the hunter, but he soon regained focus and emptied the smoldering skull of its fare. He continued collections for a few minutes when the eerie wail of rescue sirens drove him to escape. Mouth heavy with teeth taken from the newly dead, the hunter made for the hills. Ghosts of annihilation wailed from the field of wreckage. With each stride of his insect legs, the hunter's mouth rattled its catch, as if hail battered the inner surface of his skull. It tasted strange. That music. Moazareth lay unconscious. Jerfastelak parted his lover's mandibles and dropped the tiny bones into her mouth. She cooed softly, acknowledged his presence. All at once she convulsed. "Swallow them!" Jerfastelak demanded. No good. She was choking. With a pincher, Jerfastelak probed into her, unseated the mass, and consumed it. Moazareth gave a feeble wheeze. Caustic juices welled into her lover's mouth to liquefy its morsels. Immediately, he felt the pulsing fullness in his thorax. Punching through his carapace, he extracted the white glob, spattered the cave in a rain of burning gold, a shower that would end any other creature. Smoke swirled like morning mist. Left with no alternative, Jerfastelak force-fed his lover, shrilling all the while. "Please, please, please." A clacking as of submerged seashells sounded inside Moazareth. She rose, extending 8 green spiked limbs, carapace flushed with the iridescent gold of health. "My Moazareth!" Jerfastelak embraced her. Their golden tongues twined, untwined when Moazareth gently released from her lover's heat. "I doubted your return," she shrilled, "but you've shown me the folly of such thoughts." Jerfastelak surged with guilt over his recent musings, his abominable self-pity. His gaze met hers, and he saw there a violent beauty. The hunter's heart boomed. Around Moazareth's head formed a brilliant nimbus, nearly unbearable to behold. She levitated until taller than her lover. At that moment, Jerfastelak would gladly have given himself to death. So searing, so erotic was this vision. In the face of beauty, dread is annulled.
It is fortunate, shrilled Moazarith, that you have triumphed and returned. I would not relish the task of raising our offspring alone.
Dizziness invaded Jerfastalak. All at once, it did not matter that he and Moazarith were alone in the Ugly One's cheerless world. Were they not, by virtue of their very existence, miracles in such a place? One offspring, glorious, pulsed within Moazarith's womb. Would not others follow, fill the emptiness of their days?
The ages we have seen, Jerfastalak shrilled, and shared.
Something must be done to honor those whose lives had been ended so that Moazarith could keep hers. Jerfastalak took in a large quota of bones. After a few moments, he punched into himself, showered hot gold everywhere. Already his carapace began resealing. His lever dripped nuggets. White mass in pincher. He began. The Ugly Ones had not died in vain. For the artistry of their death, angels sculpted a replica of the sky-raker in which they had ended. Prideful, Jerfastalak shrilled,
a plaything for our young.
Chilling tales for dark nights.